Hi guys, welcome in that series of video about the new features of Golem 5. In this video I will focus on the new way to define geometry variation and shading variation in Golem. So I'm running Golem 5 right now, and as you can see I'm having a soldier character here, which is a pretty casual asset with a Maya skeleton on which a couple of props are skinned. And from that props you can tell that you can make a lot of geometry variation. You could make an archery guy, for example, with a couple of bows there, a quiver here. You could actually make also an infantry soldier with a couple of swords, spears, shields. There are also different armors, different helmets. So let me show you how you can deal with that variation with Golem crowds. So the geometry variation takes place into the character maker. So let's open the character maker. First select the soldier root bone of the skeleton, load the skeleton, specify what's the up axis and the front axis, define the skeleton mapping, and once you have defined the skeleton mapping, you can see that the geometry tab is now enabled. Regarding the skeleton part, there's going to be another tutorial detailing how to deal with the skeleton, so here I'm going to assume that the skeleton part is correct. So let's go into the geometry tab. If you've been using Golem before, you may notice that the interface has changed pretty widely. It's actually a brand new interface, a nodal interface to define your character variation. So the way it works is you have here a library and the way you define rendering types. So I'm speaking about the library because here there are a couple of nodes you can use to drag and drop and define different stuff. So there's a node to define a group of assets. There's a node to define a mesh, a Maya mesh, a Maya shading group, a surface shader or displacement shader or a contour shader, and also a shader attribute to deal with shading variation. I'll speak a bit more about that a bit later. So I'm gonna delete those first. And there's also a properties here panel with works like the attribute editor inside of Maya. So each time you select a node, you get the properties of that node there. So just before creating the geometry variation, I just want to give a quick heads up about best practice about how you should sort your meshes to make the process easier for you and faster. So best practice are not mandatory practices. It's just once again, it's just a way to make your life easier with the character maker. So first thing you want to make sure is if you got an asset which is composed of several meshes. So for example here, the armor is actually made of different meshes there. So when you got that kind of assets made of different meshes, make sure to put them all into the same Maya group. So here my light armor meshes, they're all parented under the light armor group. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing you want to keep in mind is if you're having variations of an asset type. So here my armors, I can have either a light armor or a heavy armor. If you're having variations like that one of the same asset, here again make sure that those are parented under the same Maya group. So let's take a look at the helmets, for example. I'm having different variations of helmets, but each mesh is an asset by its own, so I don't have to put it into its own Maya group. But as I'm having variations of the same assets type, here helmet, I put it all of those into a helmets group. In terms of left-hand weapons, it's pretty the same. I'm having different shapes of swords, the attacker sword, the defender sword, the gladiator sword, or the spear, and I put them all into the same left-hand weapon group. So I did the same for right-hand weapons, did the same for the body, and now I'm done and I can use those into my character maker. So let's select those different groups. So the body, right-hand weapons, helmet, quiver. let's open the character maker. And so there's two ways to deal with those. You can either create your own hierarchy, saying, okay, I'm having an asset group connecting it, I'm having a mesh connecting it to the mesh, etc., etc. Or if you got your Maya character and everything has been sorted correctly, you can select your character node there and ask it to import the geometry which is selected from Maya. So as you can see here, it has imported everything. It has imported the Maya groups, it has imported the meshes, the shading group of each mesh, and the shader. So here you can see the graph is pretty huge. So let me show you how you can quickly reorganize stuff. So first thing you want to notice here is that there is an auto organize button here, which is enabled by default. So you can disable it if you want to, or re-enable it. If you disable it, you can move any nodes and reorganize stuff when you want to. If you enable it, all the nodes get sorted correctly. Also, a quick keyboard shortcut you may want to know is you can hover on any node and press Shift mouse scroll up to actually close the parent, so close the children nodes of that node, and you can press Shift mouse scroll down to reopen up and reopen every hierarchy level of your character geometry file. So let's say I want to just have the first levels of asset group of my character. I can just hover the character node there, press Shift mouse up, and as you can see, it's closing more and more until I get just the first level of my different assets. So if we look at the first levels there, you can see there's a body assets group, right hand weapons asset groups, weapon, helmets, left hand weapons, and quiver, which are exactly the Maya groups I selected and imported here. So the first thing I want to do here is to weight the asset group which needs to be weighted. So speaking about weighting, so if we take a look at the body asset group here, it's actually composed of all the meshes of the body. There's the eye there, some fabrics, some really light armor, the leather accessories there, the body geometry. So here I want all my characters to have those meshes here. So I don't want to weight that asset group. So I'm gonna let it like this. If we take a look at the right hand weapons here I don't want all the characters to have all those assets. I actually want to have a variation of those. I want my characters to have right hand weapons indeed, but I want it to be either that mesh here, or that mesh, or that bow, or that bow. So here my assets group is going to be weighted. So I can select the assets group there and check the weighted icons, or I can also use the icon here if I don't want to go into the node properties. So let's remove the weighted icons here. I can press this and it created a weighted assets group. So once again, the weighted assets group means that my character is going to have a right hand weapons, which is going to be either the shield there, or that shield there, or that bow, or that bow. If you don't weight it, it means that all of them will have all those 4 assets, like in the body they'll have all those meshes which compose the body. So here it's weighted. Speaking about the armors, here again I'm going to have the choice between light armor and heavy armor, so I want it to be weighted as well. The helmets, I'm having the choice between 3 helmets, so I'm going to weight helmets. And left hand weapons, I want to weight those as well, because it's either the sword, or another sword, or another sword, or the spear. So here I've created my weighted groups. So once I have done that, I can create my rendering types. So rendering type define how a type of character will look like at a rendering time. So amongst the different rendering type I can create for my soldier character, there's the infantry rendering type. So I'm gonna create a new rendering type here, called it infantry, and as soon as I have created the rendering type, you can see the same groups which I have defined into my graph there will be displayed there as well. So I'm having the body, right hand weapons, the armors, the helmets, the left hand weapons, and the quiver. You can see that also that as soon as I have weighted a group, like my right hand weapons, as soon as I've weighted it, Each children is also listed with a weight next to it. So my right hand weapon here, which is going to be either the 2 shields or the 2 bow, you found out here as well the 2 shields and the 2 bows with some weights in front of it. So here I'm creating an infantry type, which means it's not archery guys. So if I want to remove the bows from my infantry type, I can just put the bows assets to 0 there. And now I'm having the choice between either the attacker shield or the defender shield. And I can even change the weight of those. I can say, okay, I want to have a bit more soldiers from the infantry type, which will have the attacker shield. Make sure that, well, you don't have to care about the sum of those weights. It doesn't have to be 100 at the end, because at the end, Golem will normalize the weights. So I can change the weight for the armors. I can say I want to have a bit more people with the light armor. Speaking about helmets, I can say, okay, something like this. And regarding left-hand weapons, I'm going to say, okay, I want to have a bit more people to have the swords and a bit less people to have a spear. If you want to have quick access to some value, so let's say you want every of those values to be back to 50, you can select the assets group there and press 50 here, or you can just right click and say set weights to 50 and all the weights will be set to 50. You can also set all of them to 0 as well, and just to say, okay, those 2 bows there will be set to 0, and now I can bring back a couple of shields. So okay, here's my first rendering type. So now I can create another rendering type if I want to, like let's say an archery rendering type. So I'll create an archery rendering type there, close my infantry one, and now I'm going to change the weight as well for my archery guys. So I want to make sure that all my archery guys get a bow into the right hand, so put everything to 0 except the bows. In terms of armors, I guess that most of the time archery guys get light armors. In terms of helmets, something like this. Left hand weapons here, so I'm having the choice between the swords or the spear. But as those are actually archery, I actually want those to be empty-handed. I don't want to have any asset actually into the left hand. So let me show you how you can create an empty asset. So let's go into the left hand weapons there. And so right now I'm having the choice between those 4. So the idea here is I want to create a new asset group, which is going to be empty. So I'm creating a new asset group, but I don't put any children there. I'm going to rename it empty, and I'm going to connect it to the left hand weapons. And here it is. Now I've created an empty mesh asset, and I can go back into my archery type, put everything to 0 except the empty group. So it means that my archery guy will have a bow, which is going to be either that asset or that asset. They're going to have an armor, helmets, left hand weapons, which is going to be actually nothing. So they will be empty-handed into the left hand. I want to make sure that that file now is saved. So I'm going to save the character file. I'm going to save it on the desktop. And final step I want to do is export all the meshes I have defined into an FBX file, into a geometry file. That FBX file is going to be used then to do the rendering and the previs of the character. So to export the character as an FBX, make sure that you have imported all the meshes you want to. Then go into your character node there, and you can see into the node properties of the character node, you can ask to export a geometry file. So I'm going to export the geometry file, put it into the desktop as well. We call it soldier. So it's exporting every meshes you have listed into the character file. So it's reading it from Maya, exported it into an FBX file, and at the end it lists the absolute path to that FBX file into the character node. You can see also there are some weight and height properties. So those are the bounding box properties of my character. So let's change those value. Make sure that the bounding box surrounds all the meshes of my characters. So that looks actually pretty good. And make sure to save your character file. So, okay, now the character file has been defined with the skeleton and the geometry parts. So let's take a look at how it looks like at simulation time. So here I've created two types of characters. So into those two types, I want to make sure that I have loaded my new character file, so my soldier Golaem character file. I want to also add now a rendering type. So if you remember, the rendering types are the two types we've been creating here, so either infantry or archery. So here it has assigned automatically the infantry type there, and onto my blue entity type I want to load my character file as well, and it has affected the infantry type, so let's remove it, and I want to actually affect the archery type of guy there. And now if I run the sim, I should get for the green characters my infantry characters, and for the blue characters I should get my archery guys, which is not really obvious here. My blue guys are actually having the infantry type as well. So, oh yeah, okay, sorry about that. My particles has not been updated, so let's replace my particle system here, and okay, and take a look here. So okay, I'm having now blue guys, which are archery guys. As we have defined, they have a bow into the left end and nothing into the right end. And if we take a look at the infantry guy, they're having a sword or a spear into the right end, and different shapes of shield into the left end. So one thing I can tell here is that my infantry guy actually have a quiver, and well, obviously as those are infantry guy, they don't have quiver. So let's say I don't want to have the quiver anymore. So let's take a look about how that works. So okay, I'm having here an assets group which is a quiver, and there's a mesh in it which is the quiver mesh. So here as well, I would like to have the choice between empty and that mesh. So I can either create a new asset group, named it empty and connect it to my quiver, or I can also use the same empty mesh asset which is behind there. So I can draw a connection between the quiver and the empty. By the way, you draw connection by using the middle mouse button. So now I'm saying that my quiver is going to be either, yeah, I'm going to say also that it's weighted. So I'm going to say my quiver is either going to be that mesh there or nothing at all. So I can go into the archery type, say that all of them will have a quiver, so I put the empty to 0, which means all the archery guy will have a quiver, and if I go into infantry, I put the quiver to 0 and let the empty to some value. Save the file, and hopefully I should get now infantry characters without any quiver, archery guys with the quiver. So that's for geometry variation here. Let's say now we would like to play with shading variation. You can see all those guys are wearing the light armor, which is kind of brown and red. Let's say you're having another textures and you want to make shading variation for that assets. So let's go back into the character maker. Let's figure out where is my light armor. So it's here. So let's expand that. So the light armor is composed of all those meshes here, and all those meshes are sharing the same shading group, and they are sharing the same surface shader, which is called light armor blend. So one thing I want to do is create a shader attribute, which is going to be used to make randomization into the shading graph of that asset. So to create a shader attribute, I can select my shader attribute node there, drag and drop it into the graph area, and I can connect my shading group to my shader attribute. So now let's change the values for my shader attribute. So let's give it a name first. So I'm going to use that shader attribute to make some texture variation. So I'm going to call it like a light armor, let's say text ID, and I'm going to copy paste that name because I'm going to use it a bit later. I can choose what's going to be the type of that shader attribute. So is it going to be an integer or a floating value or a file or a vector? So here what I want to do is just have a random value, an integer random value for my texture variation. As I'm going to have two texture variation, I'm going to say that that value for that light armor text ID is going to be a random value between 0 and 1. So it gives me a choice which is going to be either 0 or 1. So that's just a way to have a variation, but if you want to have more control on the top of that shader attribute, you can also use a PP attribute to feed the value of a shader attribute. So by defining a shader attribute, it means that every time we're going to create one of this mesh, we're going to apply that shading group, that surface shader, and we're also going to create a shader attribute which is going to be attached to each of those meshes, which is going to have a random value between 0 and 1. Once again, you can quickly check or change the type or the value type of your shading attribute. So if you don't want to be integer, you can say, okay, it's a floating, or it's a file, or it's a vector, or it's an integer. Or you can also say it's not a random, it's a PP controlled shader attribute. So here I'm just going to use the int and random there. Make sure to save your file, and now when you're going to render your crowds, you're going to have a new attribute which is going to be stored on your geometry. So that's just one part of the shading variation process. The other part is you want to use that attribute into your shading graph and plug it somewhere to have shading variation. So let's go now into the shading graph of that character, and let's try to figure out the shading graph for the light armor. So here's the shading graph for my light armor. So as you can see, it's like a blend surface shader, which color attribute is just connected to the texture. So if I'm gonna have a texture variation, the first thing I want to do is use a shader to make the texture variation. So I'm gonna look for a shader called switch, which is gonna be where are you? Oh, wait a minute. I may have to load Arnold first, because here I'm going to use Arnold. So I want to make sure that the Arnold plugin is loaded. So that's going to be better. So let's load the Arnold shader. Let's create a light as well. So it will react at rendering time. And let's go back to the upper shade, and let's take a look for the switch shader. So just ask for switch, and you can see here there are several switch shaders appearing. There's a switch shader for Mentor Ray, one for V-Ray, one for 3D Light, and one for Arnold. So those are the same shaders, but just for different rendering engines. So as I'm going to use Arnold there, I'm going to use the switch shader of Arnold. So click it here. It brings a new shader in your scene. If we take a look to that shader, so all the shaders for all rendering engine look the same. There's 10 different entries there, which correspond to 10 different colors or textures. There's also a default color here if there's a problem in the way you configured your shading. There's also a selector value, and depending on what's been returned by the selector value, it just switch between the different entries. So if the selector values is set up to 0, it just returns the texture or the color set up on the 0 slot. So what I want to do is connect my switch shader between my texture and my surface shader. So first I'm going to unplug this, and I'm going to use that texture and connect it to the first slot. So connected the odd color, connected to the shader 0 slot of my switch. I want to create another file node, and use that file node to connect to the shader 1 slot. So if I take a look to my switch now, I'm having an entry for shader 0 and entry for shader 1. And if I go back to my shader attribute here value, as you can see, and if you remember, it returns a value which is going to be either 0 or 1. So now what we want to do is use that shader attribute to control the value of the switch. So I'm going to move that a bit. I want to connect my switch shader to my surface shader, so connect the odd color to the color. And the final step is I want to use another shader to read the value of the shader attribute and use it to drive the value of the selector. So if you're using Arnold, you have to take a look to a shader which is called AI user data int, because we define an int shader attribute. If you're using V-Ray, you should take a look at user scalar V-Ray, but here V-Ray is not loaded. So yeah, there's a shader called V-Ray user scalar. If you're using mentor ray, you're gonna use that one there, which is crowd get user data int mentor ray, etc., etc. If we take a look at your documentation, you can find more about this shader and all their work and how they should be connected. So here I want to use my AI user data int shader connected to my selector value of my shader. So I connect the old value to the selector value. So if we take a look at the switch, you can see that now the selector value is connected to the AI user data int. And finally, I want to specify what's the name of the shader attribute I want to read from the geometry. So I want to paste the name of the shader attribute I define into my character file. So it's light armor text ID. So here I'm putting the same thing, which is light armor text ID. Just for the sake of it, I'm going to put some weird value there, which means if there's something wrong in the way that value is read from the character, it will return the default value here, which is going to be orange. So now I can actually export my simulation. So I'm done, and I can actually render my simulation. So let's switch back to Arnold, create a crowd render proxy, checking that everything is fine, and hopefully now when I'm going to render the crowd, I would have my characters, my infantry guys there, and my archery guys there, and the guy wearing the light armor should get a variation of shading between my first texture and my second texture. So let's take a look. So I'm having here red guys and gray guys. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. I think that I forgot. So let's reorganize this a bit. Yeah, okay. And I think I forgot to load my texture file. So that's why Arnold couldn't find it. So I'm having a texture file here, which is actually a blue and purple armor. So here I'm having the choice between the red armor and the blue armor. And if I render again, I should get the proper result here. As you may have noticed, each time I change the shaders and shaders variation or the shading graph, I don't have to re-export the simulation because the shading information is not baked into the shading information. So, okay, that's better now. I'm having red characters here wearing the light armors, and the blue characters here wearing the light armors as well. One final thing I wanted to say is that you may have noticed that even if I have defined my shading variation on the shading graph, the render previs doesn't get updated. All my characters are wearing the red texture, even if I have defined a blue texture in some selector and some shader attributes. The reason for that is because, well, you guys are going to do some pretty complex shading graph for your characters, which is going to be maybe an Arnold shading graph, maybe using custom nodes, and we can't really afford to analyze those shader graph and try to figure out what the characters will look like at the end. So just to make sure that we're going to display something, what we do is we look for each mesh as the name of their shading group. We find that shading group inside of Maya, and we look at what the first texture connected to the graph, and we just apply that to the render previs of the characters. So you don't get shading variation here, but you actually get geometry variations. And if you want to make sure that your shading variations has been taken into account, you have to check into your rendering. So that's all for me. I hope that it all makes sense, and see you in the next video.